All right, want to welcome you for our NVAR forms update with Ariane Hawab. Okay, and so we are. We're getting started a little bit late, but we've got a few people here and several people on the Zoom. So
is my PowerPoint up?
Your PowerPoint is on, and it is right here. And I'm going to share the screen. All right.
By the way, thank you guys for accommodating your meeting. I know that you guys wanted me to put it in the admin office, but.
Ariane, you probably are going to have to stand here because, wait a minute. Slideshow from the beginning. All right. And because the microphone is only on the computer.
Okay.
So
I'm a pacer.
okay.
So hopefully this won't be too much of an issue.
Let me move that aside.
Yeah.
So if you want to
slide for you,
Sorry?
you want me to drive the slide for you?
No, because of the microphone.
she has to be here for the microphone.
Okay.
So that's why.
But I pace, I talk with my hands. I don't know.
Oops.
Fred, can you hear her out there?
Yes, I can hear.
All right,
All right.
face away.
Go ahead.
I don't know how to move the thing.
That's right. I'll go ahead and what I'll do is I'll stand by here and I'll move the slide.
Oh, no, but do you mind moving this so that the people here can also see the slides?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to
Okay.
do.
I got you.
Okay, let's get started. And so, yeah, I'm here today to talk about the July 1 standard forms changes. So some of you might have already seen them, taken a look, or even gone to one of our classes. We're hosting quite a lot of classes this month and the next month.
Closer up there because the microphone.
He can hear. He can hear it.
Okay.
We already tested it. Did you
and
hit
then
record?
with this form change, obviously you all heard about the news with the NAR settlement coming out in March. We were already actually as a forms committee working towards some of these changes when the news came out, but then that just kind of set us off into overdrive after making sure that these were out as soon as possible before the NAR practice changes go into effect on August 17th. There's a couple of timelines that you all should be aware of. So one, March 15th is when the news of the proposed settlement came out. June 11th, you guys started seeing the proposed fields appearing on Bright, some changes on Bright, like seller concessions and whatnot. The next thing to note is August 14th. That's when Bright is implementing their practice changes. That's when they're completely removing the offer of compensation field from their display. And August 17th is when all realtors in the country are expected to abide by the new settlement. But something for the settlement is it actually hasn't been fully approved by the court yet. There could be changes. It has been preliminarily approved, but it's not going up for the judge for a final order until probably November or December. So there might be some changes by then. So we really urge you all to pay attention to the news, pay attention to what NVAR is releasing. Every day since we haven't released the educational versions of these forms back on May 29th for you all to view. Since then, we have made at least 6 or 7 changes. I've changed this slide deck like 5 times. There has been so many changes. Last night I was like out at a sports bar watching Game 7, and there was a news came in from the DOJ that Maria and I immediately had to start discussing, and then we immediately have to address that when I get back into the office today. So please, though I'm teaching all of you this today, by August 17th, there might be some changes. So please don't delete your NVAR emails, and please make sure that you're keeping up. So let's get into it. Okay. It is not, the mouse is not, I don't know how the arrow is not working. Yeah, you would think the arrow.
Where's the mouse? Okay, no, okay, let me get rid of why is this thing? I can't get rid of this.
I can give you some background though. Normally forms changes, the standard forms committee, which is made up of about 15 realtors and agents, brokers, and also about 5 attorneys, and then myself and Maria Flax as the senior director of legal affairs. We get together every month to work on forms changes, but this time was different. And Jim can attest to it. He's the vice chair of standard forms, and we were meeting like every week at a certain point. Every week we're like sending out some email being like, we all need to get together. We need to talk about this. We were meeting with attorney roundtable, which is a group of about 20 or 30 attorneys in the area.
Trying to,
We met with outside counsel. We met with, we talked to other associations. We talked to so many people this time around just to
not seeing it on
the
here.
best version of the forms for you. But please keep in mind that we also want to see how the market reacts. So when you guys actually start using them, please give us feedback. NVAR legal hotline, please tell us what you think and how you feel that it affects your business. And if you think that it's not working for you, or if there's certain things that we could do better, please tell us, because
Just click the screen when you're ready.
this is an incredibly unprecedented time. It's something that, click the screen.
Yeah.
This-
There you go.
there we go. I'll do it for you.
Okay.
Just click the pad, the mouse.
I'll do it for
The
you.
mouse that I can do.
There
Okay,
you
yeah. Alright, so let's get into it. So the broker compensation changes in the brokerage agreements and the sales contract. So we are shifting our model. It is going to be these three things: future focused, efficient, transparent. Future focused, why? We believe that the forms that we have created are going to represent what the industry looks like in the future. So we know that, certain associations are trying to keep certain methods of the old models. You all know that the real estate industry shifts every 10 to 15 years. And the best agents are the ones that are able to adapt and survive that. I've talked to given this class now, like so many times, and every single time somebody is like, well, I've been an agent for 30 years. And I remember when there was no buyer agency, or like I've been an agent for, 10 years. I remember when Zillow started. And then there's also newer agents, and they're probably actually going to have the easiest time because they are not kind of fixed on the cooperative compensation model. Another thing with our forms they are probably going to be more efficient for you all. What we have created eliminates the need for additional addendums or broker fee agreements, like other associations are doing, to keep from doing anything unnecessary. What's going to happen now is that any payment, any financial.
No.
I don't like hearing that.
Sorry.
It's okay. Any financial contribution from the seller to the buyer's broker is just going to be on the sales contract, just flat on the first page, on paragraph 2, on those line items. That's the final place where you determine it, and that's where it's going to be. You don't have to do an addendum to clarify what additional compensation is out there. You don't need to check with your broker about changing the amount. That's just what it's going to be. Another thing is we find our forms to be more transparent. It's clear for agents and it's clear for consumers. That's important that it be clear to both of them. That if consumers are aware, then they're not going to be as combative with you. You can easier explain how you get paid and the commission structure to them, especially if you understand the forms better. So, all right. So under the NAR settlement, there are 3 types of broker compensation available. Even though our forms are going to only allow for 2 of these models, we just wanted to let you know that cooperative compensation, which is the practice of sharing the commission, right, where a portion of it comes from the listing broker compensation and is shared with the buyer's broker, that is still allowed, the cooperative compensation model. Is your firm not doing this? So I can tell them.
And my slides aren't advancing on the Zoom, they're just
Okay.
advancing for us.
Okay.
Sorry for the technical trouble.
So,
I have an idea.
I think you're not more screen sharing.
We're screen sharing the wrong screen.
Sure.
And so.
There's 3 types of broker compensation. One, cooperative, as I mentioned, listing broker to buyer's broker. This was the model that you all are kind of used to, and that's what our forms primarily allow for, the commission split. The second one is seller subsidy or seller concessions. You all have been probably hearing about this quite a bit on social media. It's what probably your broker has been telling you, like, hey, you guys use seller concessions or seller subsidy. because you can advertise it on the MLS, because you can no longer advertise offers of compensation on the MLS after August 17th. The thing is, with seller subsidy or seller concessions or seller contributions to closing costs, whatever term you prefer, it goes directly from the seller to the buyer. And then the buyer is able to use it for whatever they want to use it for. They can use it for their roof, they can use it to fix a fence, they can use it to pay their buyer's agent. They don't have to. And you can't guarantee, you can't force them to use it for any of those things. It's for whatever the buyer wants. The third one, which is new, is seller paid buyer agency or buyer broker compensation. That is from the seller to the buyer agent directly. Okay, that is something that our forms will now facilitate for. It's the listing broker would not have a say in how to set that amount. It's something that the seller determines. And ultimately, since they still come out of the seller's proceeds, it kind of ends up looking the same on the Alta. So currently our forms have cooperative compensation only. There is a seller subsidy line in the sales contract, but not in our listing agreement. And there's no mechanism for seller paid buyer broker compensation. Okay. I'm scared.
I'm not, I got you. Here you go. You want to change slides?
Yes. What is the best mechanism to do that?
Well, one, just make sure that you're on this screen and the mouse will curve over to this one. So I'll keep you on this screen now.
Oh, you're extending the screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then this arrow down here, we'll just keep the mouse right here and then you should just click.
Sure. Got it. So the current model with cooperative compensation that is currently facilitating our forms that you guys are using right now today, what are the pros and cons? And the reason I give you guys this background is because we know that for some agents that haven't been, you know, everybody's on a different scale in terms of how they're paying attention to the news. So we don't want you all to be shocked. But with this current model, agents understand how it works, sort of. It can be difficult to explain the commission split to somebody who's not in the real estate industry or who's never bought or sold a home before. I know that myself, like I'm 30 years old, so me and my friends, we don't own homes. And whenever I explain to them what I do or dealing with realtor commissions, they're like, what? I had no idea. They're like, I didn't know. And then it also takes me like 20 minutes to explain it. I think I speak pretty clearly, but even then the commission split model is a little bit muddled. Another pro is that buyers don't have to understand the services or fees for the agent to get paid. Is that really a pro? Bright MLS did a study across consumer buyers and found that a lot of buyers actually had no idea how their buyer's agent got paid or where the money came from. And that's probably not the greatest thing. And currently, not in the near future, the buyer broker commission, the cooperative compensation, is determined by the listing broker, right? Because a portion of it comes from the listing broker's compensation, and your brokerage sets that rate. And it's obviously not going to be determined on the value for the buyer's agent. You all are making a blanket unilateral offer of compensation. Yes? It happens. Seems like 6 times while we're here. It's not determined on the value for buyer agent services. You're making the same offer to every buyer's agent, regardless of what they do, how experienced they are, what resources they provide, or even how they help you get to the end of the transaction. And that was what the jury in the Burnett and Sitzer case, and that's what the DOJ found to be problematic. Why is the same offer being made to every agent, regardless of what they do? So what are the cons? So now, because cooperative compensation is no longer allowed on the MLS or offers of compensation, there has to be a separate negotiation required between the brokerages. So something like the VAR broker fee agreement, the Form 500, where the brokers would sign with each other. I've seen now, my cousin in California sent me a link to this website that apparently a lot of brokerages are putting together their offers of compensation there. I told him, I'm like, that's going to be another, the DOJ is going to see that, and that's going to go down, and all the brokerages are going to be taken down with it. But they love that, so we'll see. Liability and litigation risks. The DOJ is not gonna stop. What they want is full decoupling, which means that each party pays their own agent. Okay, so and they haven't. They just on Friday started a formal inquiry into California Association's forms. Because they were supposed to be released in June, and there was something about those forms that the DOJ said, no, you're not releasing those. And we're gonna figure out the results of that very shortly, I think today. So there is litigation that's gonna be ongoing. And so this model is going to be a way of the past. It's also a lack of transparency to the consumer. As I mentioned, buyers don't know how their agents get paid. And also, this last point, and I don't mean this for any of you all, I know you guys are excellent agents. This supports low value buyers agents at the expense of high value buyers agents. So, as I said before, when a blanket unilateral offer of compensation is made, that same offer made to every buyer's agent, how does that incentivize the buyer's agent to be putting out the best services possible? If they know that simply by bringing a buyer, they earn that commission. How does that incentivize, agents to compete with each other? And this was where we were seeing some issues. Okay. So if we move away from that model, move away from cooperative compensation, we can be more proactive to anticipated market changes. We find that our forms were pretty proactive this time around. We went kind of above and beyond, and we're listening to where we think that the market's going to go based on all of our advice that we've received from many attorneys. It's going to be more efficient, more transparent, as I mentioned, and the parties can negotiate directly on the contract what goes to the buyer's agent from the seller.
Can you repeat that last sentence?
The parties are going to be able to negotiate directly on the contract for financial contributions from the seller to the buyer's broker.
So exploring what that means in the situation. So our buyer agency agreement defines our compensation, right?
I'm going to show this. I'm going to dive into
Okay.
it. Yeah.
All right, but the actual negotiation is going to occur on the contract. And that's really an important piece here. And I know that a lot of agents are getting confused about that, but it's actually going to be on the contract and part of every single deal if there's going to be any kind of seller
Contribution, yeah.
Yeah.
I would hesitate to use the word concession as a blanket term.
Yeah.
Or, and I'm not saying this at you, it's every class I've taught at.
I know, I'm spanking myself all the time.
So, because concessions refer to from a seller to a buyer for their closing costs or subsidies and whatnot. So it's not, if it's coming from the seller, yes, it is like a financial contribution. It is basically a credit from the seller's net proceeds. But if it's going directly to the buyer's agent, it doesn't work the same way as a concession does. It actually avoids some lender issues. So what are some challenges with our forms changes and with the model that we are going towards? The agents are going to need to work harder to demonstrate their value because now the compensation conversation is going to be upfront. I'm sure you all already having consumers and clients coming to you going, hey, I heard this in the news. I heard about realtor compensation. I heard about this lawsuit. What's going on? And that's a tough conversation to have, and it's also tough to explain. A lot of people don't feel comfortable talking about how they get paid, but a lot of them are going to have to, especially in the case of representing buyers, because ultimately the buyer is responsible for a broker compensation. That was always the case, but now with seller contributions not guaranteed, it's a really important conversation to have. It will also require a lot of education. I really appreciate you all for being here. And you may need to come to multiple classes because this is a lot. And sometimes I've had to teach, and at the end, everybody's kind of quiet because they're just processing it. And it may take them a couple days for it to hit them, but please, reach out. We want to explain this to you. So let's dive into it. The listing agreements. We moved up the broker, and this is for the this is for the residential home sales agreements. I am going to talk about how this impacts rentals later. Do you guys do rentals? Okay. I am going to talk about how this impacts rentals later, but focus on home sales for now. So in the listing agreements, we moved up the broker compensation paragraph to paragraph 6. We used to be paragraph 12 earlier, but we want you to have the conversation earlier. We moved the disclaimer up, and let me just show you what it looks like. Okay, you want to get up and come? I don't really care. We renamed it to listing broker compensation because we want to make it very, very clear that now you are just putting your list, what you as the listing agent are getting paid in this section. You are no longer doing your total compensation because our forms are no longer going to facilitate for the commission split. So you are saying seller will pay broker compensation of X. Seller will pay you, listing broker, the amount that you list your rate is. Okay, nothing that associates with the buyer's broker anymore. We've also added this new subsection, additional listing broker compensation for unrepresented buyer. This came from a broker request, many broker requests. It has a checkbox at the beginning because it's optional. And what does this mean? So we do anticipate in the short term a rise of unrepresented buyers. There is going to be kind of a learning curve in this next year where buyers agents are trying to figure out how to articulate their value and what this all means for them. And there's going to be a lot of buyers who think that, oh, well, I don't need a buyer's agent. Then the market will correct itself when people realize, oh crap, we actually do need representation at the settlement table. But in the meantime, what this section does is it allows for you as the listing broker to get additional compensation in the event that an unrepresented buyer ratifies the contract. And that's because unrepresented buyers can create, you guys know, they can create a huge hassle. Those cases are very difficult to settle. There's always a lot of emotions, and the ministerial acts can end up taking a lot more of your time than you anticipate. So you deserve to get paid for that. It's also a really great opportunity for you, if you represent sellers, to explain to them when they get to this section, they go like, why do you get paid more if there's an unrepresented buyer on the other side? Isn't that great? And then that's a good opportunity to explain to your seller, well, if you're not offering, not like contributions to a buyer's agent, you're going to get a lot of this. So not only are you going to have to pay me more, but you're going to have a way harder time at the settlement table. So it's actually a really good marketing tactic. The variable rate compensation paragraph is still there. And that's up to your brokers, how you all fill that out. Okay, so that's the broker compensation paragraph. But what about the buyer's broker? So on the listing agreement, we have a new paragraph 7, which is seller paid buyer broker compensation. So this is optional. There's a checkbox at the beginning, and it's for seller to pay the buyer's broker directly. So why do I emphasize that it goes directly to the buyer's broker? One, it guarantees the payment to the buyer's broker. But second, this is based on guidance released from like Fannie, Freddie, VA, etc. If a payment goes to the buyer's broker directly from the seller, it could avoid lender limits on interested party credits. So you all know that with like certain loans, there's limits on how many concessions or subsidies that a buyer can receive from the seller. I think like a lot of loans are like 3% or 4% or whatever. So if that's the case, then if you want to also contribute to the buyer's broker, or let's say in certain scenarios, the buyer's broker contribution exceeds those limits, then the buyer is prohibited from taking that. So that's why it's good to direct it directly to the buyer's brokers, that it avoids those limits, and lenders recognize that as an exception because it's broker compensation. It's also not taken from the listing broker compensation. I really want to drive this home that you guys are filling out your forms properly. Because if you guys are still putting the total in the listing broker compensation and you're putting an amount for seller to buyer's broker, the seller's going to be on the hook for that total and that amount. So that's quite a lot to ask of your seller. So please make sure that you're filling out that properly. Let me show you actually how it looks so that it's not so speculative. So this is the new paragraph 7 in the listing agreements. Seller paid buyer broker compensation, optional. You fill it out as to what your seller is willing to offer the buyer's broker. Since it's still an offer of compensation, it cannot be advertised on the MLS. But I need you all to move away from that mental hurdle. So I know that you guys love the MLS. You guys love advertising everything on there. You guys love making the same offer to every agent, the blanket, a lateral offer. But that's we got to change that, because that's not what the DOJ wants anymore. We need to be negotiating offers of compensation, financial contributions to buyers and to buyers brokers on the sales contract as part of the offer. So while we have this in here, this is more guidance for the listing broker, so that, let's say, buyers agents call them and go, are you offering anything? They can say yes. But the best practice, instead of like, because a lot of you guys are spending your mental energy, I've taught this class times. And so many of the questions we get, people are just like wasting a lot of time going, well, what can we advertise it here? Can we advertise it here? Can I take a picture of the number 3 and post it on a pillow and put it in my pictures of the home? It's like, oh my gosh, like, no, just instead of spending your energy trying to find workarounds, try to work with this model. Try to, move forward. Instead, because you can still advertise that you're making offers of compensation on your brokerage website. You can still advertise on your social media. You can put it on your sign riders. You can even put a specific amount. But I would shy away from specific amounts. I would just say, hey, accepting all offers, working with all buyers, brokers, what?
Wink, wink, code, wink,
No
winks.
codes, no wink winks. Yesterday I got a call about somebody being like, if they text this like code or number, this specific whatever, like, can I just send them the offer of compensation? And it's like, okay, I mean, like, technically that is a workaround, but it's just not, you're wasting time. Just say, like, accepting all offers, like, just tell me what you got, tell me what you're asking for. What's up, Jim?
So, can we put in the agent remarks, call agent for compensation?
You can say, call agent, here's my phone number, but you cannot say for compensation. You cannot reference compensation in any way on the MLS, including in the agent remarks.
Can you say call agent with questions?
Yeah, you can call agent with questions. One more thing, if you are offering like concessions, like, which is seller to buyer directly, that obviously can be advertised on the MLS because it goes to the buyer. But that's also a really great opportunity of just saying offering concessions. So that, if they reach out, they go, hey, you're offering concessions. Are you willing to make a portion of those concessions buyer's broker compensation? But that's a way better method, instead of like, I'm going to make a website that just does offers. Like, just instead of wasting your money, offers, yeah.
I just want to make clarification. So say the seller is down 2%.
Sure.
2.5%,
We can
whatever.
do numbers here because we are in one brokerage.
If an agent calls me and asks, is the seller offering anything? I'm not allowed to tell them.
You are allowed to tell them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, in the MLS, we have it that we can't say it's compensation, but we say that it's a concession. So like, say there was like $20,000 concession.
Sure.
If you could divide it up in all different ways. And it seems like the best thing to do would be just to tell the agent, look at the concessions in the listing. And then let them decide how they're gonna negotiate, what goes to the buyer, what goes. Now, if the seller didn't put down anything there, down 0, say,
That's what I was gonna get
they
to.
can still.
Yes.
But they did have concessions listed, so if the concession was that the contract's written that the whole concession goes to the buyer, broker fee, is then that count as the seller paid buyer's broker compensation, so that it doesn't affect.
Yeah, let me get into that. So, this is basically for advertising purposes. So there's a line in here, it's kind of blocked by the Zoom thing, but it says buyer's broker compensation. Seller understands that buyer broker compensation is negotiable and will ultimately be determined by a ratified sales contract between the seller and the buyer. So the amount that's in here, it may change, and it's ultimately going to be decided by that contract and by the seller and the buyer. And you don't need to go back in here and amend it. Like, let's say you're offering 0, but then later an offer comes in that's just like, it's great, and your seller wants to take it, but they're asking for a financial contribution. They're asking specifically for seller paid buyer broker compensation. And so the amount in there is higher than 0. You don't need to come back in here and amend this, because it's ultimately going to be determined by this. The listing broker really has no say in what is in this section. Now, as a listing broker, because you're the expert and they hired you for a reason, they may ask you, like, hey, what do you recommend I put in here? And you can go, yeah, based on my experience, based on the comps in this area, yeah, you could put this, and then that's fine, and that's up to the seller to determine. And it's also up to the parties to eventually determine when they get to the sales contract. The same thing is gonna apply to concessions.
I got one question.
Yeah.
Fred, I see your hand up. Give me a second.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the
Sure,
chat.
okay, I got you. About, what if it goes the other way? So I'm gonna say a bait and switch, some realtor.
Yeah, good
I
question.
call, I'm looking at 20 properties this weekend for an out of town client. And I call 20 agents, they say I'm offering the seller is offering 2.5% buyer paid broker compensation. I don't really have, I need to memorialize that maybe in an email, but I go 2 days before I show it, and then they change their mind and actually lower it to another price.
Mhm.
To say, oh, they're now only offering 2%. But my conversation email with them was at 2.5.
Yeah, good question. So a couple of things there. One, so the reason you all feel this, like, that when you make that offer, it is set, is because that's how it was on the MLS. Offers of compensation on the MLS between listing broker and buyer's broker are technically their own binding contract. So that it can't be changed after an offer is made. That's why you guys all print your listings and attach it with your offer to make sure you can memorialize that. I know you do that. But it's not going to be the case anymore. It's going to ultimately be determined by the sales contract. So everything that came before, all discussions, texts, emails that happened before the offer stage, it doesn't, what matters is what ends up in the sales contract ultimately. So if you are worried that, like, for example, if the seller is offering like a wildly different amount from what's in the sales contract, you would have to prove that they have committed some sort of fraud or false advertising or misleading advertising. Like, they very specifically made it so that, fraud in the inducement is the legal principle that it's called, that they've induced people through fraudulent means, or they advertised on false pretenses or something like this. But when negotiations ultimately come down to the seller and the buyer, let's say like a listing broker is saying like, my seller is offering like 30%, and a buyer's broker goes like, or buyer goes like, wow, I really want that. They put an offer down, and then they get to the contract, they make their offer with 30% in the line item, and the seller comes back with their counter offer and it's 0. What do you do when you get a counter offer that you don't agree to? You just don't sign that contract. You don't ratify that contract. So it's still up to the buyer whether they want to take that property. And at that point, that's up to the buyer and the seller, because they're the ones negotiating the contract. But false advertising is still an ethical claim. If people are still going to do that, then you can still file a code of ethics violation against them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, we'll see how it plays out. Yeah.
Let me grab Fred's question real quick.
Yes.
Fred, you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Okay, yeah, hi. Okay, so we've talked about, and there's another question here on the chat board about this too, both the listing agreement and the buyer broker agreement have paragraphs that address compensation. Will the contract itself also have a paragraph that addresses compensation, or does that have to be written in?
I don't want to answer this. I feel like I've been talking about the contract and how it's going to be determined by the parties in the contract, but yes, it will ultimately be determined by the contract. There will be a line item on there that addresses seller payment to buyer broker compensation.
It's right under the, so.
It's on the first page of the contract.
Of the new contract effective July 1st.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll get to that.
Yeah, so she's gonna cover.
Okay, so you're getting to that. Okay. Okay, so basically, we've talked a lot about this, but basically the contract is going to trump both the listing agreement and the buyer broker agreement.
It's going to trump the listing agreement, not the buyer broker agreement.
Okay.
I will get into it.
So,
Well, both could change, no?
Yes, if you amend the buyer broker agreement, then yeah.
Yeah.
But the
You couldn't amend the buyer broker agreement on the contract?
no.
no,
I will get
Well, no, you can't amend one on a different contract, but the contract, you couldn't change the contract to be different than what the buyer broker agreement says?
Uh,
You have to change the buyer broker agreement also?
yeah, you can, but, let me get into.
I know you can. Do you have to? I guess that's the question.
Let me get into that and then I can.
Okay.
give that question after.
Fair enough.
Let me, and there's a couple of questions here. So Eric is asking, so is it safe to assume the COE no longer applies to writing the commission into
Great.
the contract?
Great
Used-
question.
Used to be, we could not be party to the contract, if I am saying this correct.
Yes, so the buyer's broker, neither broker is still party to the contract. Because don't forget now that the seller is making the payment, yes, directly to the buyer's broker, but that doesn't make the buyer's broker a party to the contract. It's a promise it's a promise between seller and buyer that seller will pay that to their agent. It creates a third party beneficiary right, which is a complex legal principle that I'm not going to get into, but as for Article 16 of the Code of Ethics, it's very possible that that might not apply anymore to our forms, because again, listing broker has no say in the financial contributions to the buyer, and also because offers of compensation are not going to be made on the MLS. So as I said before, there's no like binding contract to rely upon of like an offer was made, then later it's changed. And that's because it's going directly from the seller to the buyer's broker.
And Beth is asking, so this paragraph is unenforceable until noted on the contract along with the listing compensation too?
I would not say unenforceable. I would say that it's a negotiable term. It's basically saying like, this is a guiding principle for the seller to their listing broker, so that the broker knows what to advertise, what to tell buyers agents that are calling in. Jim has his hand raised because he was there when we had this discussion.
Yeah, so this is going to allow us as listing agents to answer that phone call from the buyer broker or buyer agent, and say, how much is the seller off? Now you can answer that because you have it in writing. And if that's zero, then you're gonna have to say zero. Right? So it's just giving you guidance on how to answer that phone call from the buyer agent, which as buyer agents, we're all gonna make that phone call, right? The challenge comes with, even if I'm a listing agent and I send you a piece of paper that says the seller is offering this, that doesn't mean that your buyer can't put something different in the contract and it becomes a negotiation between buyer and seller. So this is a guideline to allow listing agents to answer the question, but it doesn't, I wouldn't say unenforceable, but it doesn't mean that it can't change in the contract between the two parties.
Right. Right. It's a really good way of thinking about it is like the sales price, right? That is not always the same in the listing agreement as it ends up being in the contract. And you guys don't think of sales price as unenforceable. That's like the key term that you all are using in your advertising and in your conversations with buyers, brokers, and buyers. So it's the same kind of concept. It's not always going to end up the same. It's ultimately going to determine based on the parties, their offer, the strength of the offer, and what happens during the closing process. Okay, so we have a new paragraph 8 as well for seller subsidy or seller concessions. That is again specifically from the seller to the buyer. The reason we use the term subsidy in our forms is because it was already there. It was already in the sales contract on that first page. It was already in the definition. So we just figured it'd be the same thing. We didn't realize Bright was going to do concessions and everyone would latch on to the word concessions. If we feel that everybody prefers the term concessions, we'll make the switch. But so as I mentioned, the terms that we're using here, the fields that we're using here are very similar to what you guys have already started seeing in Bright. It's not guaranteed payment for buyer broker compensation. A buyer is free to use it for whatever they want. And as I said, this is what it's going to look like. So the seller can either not consider a seller subsidy, or if they will consider it, they authorize broker to market X, an unspecified amount or a specific amount. This is again another guiding principle for you as a listing broker to help you advertise. And it's ultimately going to be determined in the sales contract as it was always before. But also another thing to remember, this paragraph, it can be used. The paragraph 7 can be used. You can use neither of them, or you could use both. It's up to your seller what they want to contribute and how much of which one they want to use.
Put a default condition if nothing's checked.
A
I can't
default,
see it from smart map.
this is for seller subsidy. So you can put anything default in here, or you can put an unspecified amount. What do you mean?
If neither of the first two boxes are checked, seller will not, or seller will,
Yeah,
is there default?
there's no default. We talked about this, yeah.
No, that's why I'm like.
We didn't do a
It's
default. There is no default. But ultimately, since listing broker doesn't have really a say in it, I would not argue that it's not ratified. I wouldn't argue that it's like a not ratified listing agreement. It can always change, but I do think that you guys would either choose one of these two, which is will not or will consider. We talked about doing a checkbox at the beginning, right? You know, I think we didn't go that way. That's a good point.
Yeah, I think we decided if you had a checkbox at the beginning, then you had to have a default condition if the box was checked.
Right.
So
Yeah.
we're
Okay.
moving towards it, no doubt.
But again, this may be subject to lender limits, so please be mindful of the amount that can be put in here. All right, buyer broker agreement. And I'm gonna bring it home to sales contract, then I can take more questions. So the buyer broker agreement, we actually didn't need to change it too much. And that was because it's actually mostly already compliant with what the NAR settlement provides. It has the disclaimer, it has like, you know, a specific amount. We've already told you all, we've been telling you all, do not put per MLS or whatever the seller is offering in your amount. You need to be putting a specific identifiable amount. We have added a line. This is actually a new thing that we did yesterday. We have added a line that just really clarifies one of the practice changes from NAR, which is broker may not retain any additional compensation from any source that exceeds broker compensation. So this is actually really applicable for builder bonuses, for example. You can only, as a buyer's broker, you can only receive the amount that is in this line. And anything additional, your buyer would have to agree to it. You can do an amendment, if something like that, but you cannot, as a buyer's broker, receive anything additional to what is in there. We've also added this new subsection here that it is optional, and it's kind of really helpful for you all as buyer's brokers to kind of get a sense of what your buyer needs. And this is like directing language to use a buyer's broker that instructs you that buyer will request a seller contribution to broker compensation. And it gives you some sort of guidance. So when you're calling for showings, when you're looking at properties for them, to let them know whether or not that property is offering some sort of concession or seller paid buyer broker compensation or a combination of both. So that you know what your buyer needs. So again, this has not changed too much. Please be putting specific numbers in here. I think we've already told a lot of our forms providers to not allow for text in those blanks, only numbers. But I don't know if everybody's applied with that. Yes,
Debbie's asking, can there be a range in broker compensation? I love this question.
I don't agree with that. I think no, because the NAR settlement contemplates having a specific identifiable or ascertainable amount. Not something that is a range. If it needs to change later, you can feel free to amend it up until the settlement date. Because don't forget, the buyer is responsible for repayment of broker compensation at settlement. So you have until then to, if you need to amend it, you can.
And so I just to kind of follow up on that, you know, this is why we've been really hitting that hard on the buyer agency agreements and the listing agreements. Whenever there's any kind of a range like that, that's why I've been kicking that back. Because that's really very important. We've got to have specificity and clarity with exactly what's in these. When we start adding additional language to try to amend this, yes, but, and if that, that gets to the point that she just mentioned about the lack of it being specific and clear. So
It's also not transparent to a consumer. What content, what ends, how do you end up with one end of the range versus the other?
exactly.
Why is your value a range? You need to be specific.
So in our compliance, that's exactly what we're looking for. The specificity, a specific number or a specific percentage that's easily calculated.
Yes.
So in the bottom paragraph where you said here, the broker may not retain any additional compensation
Yeah.
from any source that exceeds broker compensation. You then said that unless there's an addendum that's been signed by the buyer and the agent. Is
Yeah,
that
you, I
what
mean,
you
like,
said?
you can you can't retain any additional compensation to this. Okay, but if this amount incorporated whatever and like, let's say, okay. You and your buyer agree to, you know, a pillow and a seller or a seller builder is offering a bed. If you were like, hey, buyer, they're offering this bed to me, would you be okay with changing this to say pillow plus bed? And if the buyer agrees to that, then you have a new buyer broker compensation. But don't forget, it's very possible that, what if the contract falls through, right? What if the buyer voids on that specific purchase? Then the buyer is on the hook for pillow plus bed. And you can't always guarantee that the next property you put an offer on is going to have a pillow plus bed. So just be mindful of that.
And as a matter of handling this administratively, so if we're going to amend the buyer agency agreement, are in order to allow for that difference, administratively, would you say that you would want to have us signing off on that as the brokerage? Or
It's a decision that needs more time.
Yeah, not currently. I think
Okay.
case by case, if you start to see a trajectory that's going, it's becoming not the shortcut, but the way, then we'll have that discussion.
Okay.
But for now, I think agents just do what you need to do to
make the deal.
do your business, then we'll.
make the deal and.
Yeah.
see what-
It's something that shouldn't happen too often.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Can we grab
Yeah.
Kathy's hand real quick?
Yeah.
Yes.
Kathy, come off mute.
Hey, everybody. So, you know, we've already seen competitive listing appointments where you say, oh yeah, I'll take a haircut on my commission and da 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 da. I see this now becoming the same with buyer broker meetings, which is the intent, right? And so you're meeting a buyer. Yes, I'd love to work with you. You have to sign this agreement. I will only charge you, you know, a bunch of bananas to help you buy a house. And that's what you write into this contract. And then you take them to a listing that's been on the market forever, where the seller is offering more than a bunch of bananas. And so you say, I'm going to show this to you, and this is really great because they're going to cover my compensation and or they're going to give you a commission, what are we calling it?
Contribution.
A contribution. How do we keep that extra bunch that the seller's offering? Without our buyers being like, oh, well, you always agree to just this. I know you've been working with me for 6 months and I know it's been a lot, but I'd actually, you know, I don't want you to keep that. I think that should come to the deal. That's kind of what I see happening with this clause.
Yeah, I mean, that's not, this is what NAR has required now as a practice change. So it's not something that we just added because we wanted to. This is an NAR required practice change. And it was something that the plaintiff's attorneys agreed to with NAR and with the assistance from the DOJ as well.
So it seems to me like I would say to the buyers, look, I'm going to give you great service. I'm going to charge you this amount. If it comes in less and we can't negotiate it, don't worry about it. You and I'll renegotiate. Or we just are willing to pass up buyer broker representation deals where we're not getting what we want. I mean, I'd like just to hear the group's response to how this is going to play out.
Harry, Kathy, I don't know if you can hear me or not, so we've all known, Dan's seen it, Andrew's seen it, I've seen it. We used to write, and we can talk percentages here again because we're in one brokerage. We used to write 2.5% or per the MLS, okay, well, because we used to say, or we'd say 3% per the MLS, and if it was 3%, I'm sorry, if it was 2.5%, then we would say to the buyer, don't worry, I'll accept what they're paying. You can't say that anymore because they might not be paying anything. So your best bet here, number one, it comes down to value, which you have to prove to your buyer. But secondly, put in the highest number that you want. Because you can negotiate down.
The buyer will be
What's the
always
message-
happy to negotiate
Yeah.
down.
Well, what's the message you're sending to the buyer if you say, I'll take 2, the seller's offering 2.5, and you go back to them and you say, hey, I want you to sign this addendum so I can make more money. Wrong message, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's part of that's why they introduced this practice
Right,
change.
so aim high and be willing to negotiate down.
Yeah.
Rather than try to be that affordable buyer agent. Who then loses out because the seller's offering more money.
And as an administrative process, that's why, you know, for those of you who had been using per MLS, you know, you had seen that I was kicking that back.
Yep.
You know, even before this.
Yeah, we were talking about this a year ago.
Even before the settlement came by, I was kicking that back because of the specificity that we're looking for. Per MLS was never a term that we could really use. And so that's why we've been kicking that back. And so,
It's funny because like when you read like the legal, like the court documents and everything, and you see per MLS written in like a court document, that's how you know it's a bad term. So.
Yeah.
It is a lot. I understand. These are a lot of practice changes coming at you. This summer is asking for a lot from you all as agents. And it is a huge shift in your practice. That's why I tried to give you the background information. It's not going to be an overnight thing. It's going to be a lot of new conversations that we probably haven't had before. I understand that it's really difficult. I don't have answers to a lot of these questions because I'm not on the field. So I really appreciate like Jim, your input, and the rest of you, your input.
Will unrepresented buyer commission be a part of the contract?
Any compensation, well, what do you mean?
Well, like you said, the listing agent is getting additional compensation as an unrepresented buyer.
The additional compensation would come from the seller, so no, it would not be on the sales contract. The sales contract only addresses, I'm actually gonna get to it right now, I'll show you. The sales contract only addresses a contribution from the seller to the buyer or the buyer's broker. And okay, in all of our forms, I'm gonna get to the sales contract in a second. All of our forms, we have changed cooperating broker to either buyer's broker or tenant's broker respectively. And we've updated all of our boilerplate. So if you do see that, if I didn't talk about a form today and the form number changed on the bottom, it's probably one of these two things. But you can always ask me on the hotline and I can tell you what really happened, if there was anything more. Okay. So sales contract. So I've been hinting at it, but here is the new version. So that first page, paragraph 2, the line items that you guys all fill out so neatly and properly. We've already had the section in here for 2D seller subsidy to buyer, which is again, seller to buyer, still allowed. And now we have a new seller payment towards buyer broker compensation. So this is directly from seller to buyer's broker. That's how it gets dispersed on the Alto. We talked to settlement attorneys, we talked to title agents. They are familiar with this. They understand it. As I said, it does not create, the buyer's broker does not become party to the contract. But they become like a third party beneficiary, which is a legal contract principle that allows them to, enforce this against the seller should the seller not pay it out, but that shouldn't be an issue because it gets dispersed at the settlement table. But it's just a bit of legalese we put in there for the meantime, just to see how this shakes out.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
For us, I'm a lender. So what is it that I have that tells me if the buyer is obligated?
Good question. Good question. So
Because
that's part of the financing. So something we've talked about with lenders very recently about is that when the buyer comes in with their loan, the pre-qual, that whole process, they should actually be providing their buyer broker agreement to lenders so that the lenders are aware of the buyer's full financial pictures and obligations. Because if the seller isn't offering anything or isn't offering enough to cover that full amount, buyer is obviously responsible for the overage. And that's going to be part of what a buyer's financial obligations are. So that's actually something that buyers should be prepared to do. They may have to provide it at the settlement table to the settlement agent. You still don't have to provide it to the seller or the listing agent. The seller or the listing agent still doesn't have to provide it at the listing agreement. But it's because it's part of now, what the buyer's obligations are.
Yeah, so that'll be that, and just to correct me if I'm wrong, though, that will also be part of the cash needed to close.
Right, yeah.
So
Right,
that
yeah.
is going to be disclosed, so that's why that is gonna be critically important. So can you talk a little bit about E?
Yes,
With respect to the fact that we were just talking about unrepresented buyers.
yes.
Okay. E doesn't cover that
Mhm.
because it is not,
We
because.
don't have a buyer's broker.
Correct, but, so how are we addressing an unrepresented buyer agent, an agent who is working with an unrepresented buyer as a sub-agent? So how are we going to document that agent's ability to receive compensation if they are not representing buyer?
They're representing them as a sub.
No, they're not representing them. They're working with them, they're not working with them. The agent is unrepresented. The buyer is unrepresented
Okay,
by the agent.
okay.
The agent still wants to receive compensation.
Oh, okay, okay.
How,
So
yeah,
obviously in our form, what we have it is that additional compensation is requested from the seller. Because it's a seller charge.
so
Like
are we amending the
But
disclosure?
if you as a buyer, as you as a seller agent, a listing agent. Want to receive the fees instead from the unrepresented buyer, that's a separate agreement you would need to have with the unrepresented buyer. You wouldn't take that from the seller as well, you wouldn't double dip. But you would need to do a specific kind of agreement that really outlines that you are not their agent, that this is not a representation agreement, this is simply like an independent contractor thing.
Let me jump in for you. This was a broker discussion we had.
It's definitely a broker.
Yeah, amongst 5 different states that license it, so it's different by jurisdiction, but we're thinking, there's no sub-agency that's gonna be offered it. But to maybe Kathy's point, well, why do I wanna go through all the liability of, representing a buyer if they don't want me to do my full job? I'm essentially just gonna be a limited service agent. But I still wanna get my compensation contributed to by from the seller. So I won't represent them from buyer agency standpoint, but I will be doing
Ministerial acts.
ministerial acts and asking for a contribution for that on the contract. Is that possible?
So you want to ask for a contribution from the buyer on the sales contract? I would argue no.
Yeah, so that's in the listing agreement. That's a contract between you and the seller. It's a listing agreement. So when the title company sends you that questionnaire about what you think the compensation is, you have an agreement between you and the seller saying, in the event that the buyer is unrepresented, you pay me this instead of that.
So I'm saying that.
But if you want it from the buyer, if you want it,
If I'm representing the buyer, just doing limited service or ministerial acts, and I want a $2,000 for preparing the contract for them, sending it in, but I want my $2,000 contributed by the seller to pay for my ministerial acts to the buyer. But I'm not entering into an agency relationship because I don't want
Yeah.
liability of not paying a full vote to represent them.
so you can't, you have to do a separate agreement with the buyer, but not an agency agreement. Because
So-
Virginia law allows for you to you can get paid, but still not be their agent for providing services for them, such as ministerial acts. But it would not be associated with the sales contract, because that amount that buyers pay you is like a separate obligation that they owe you. Like, for example, like if they hire an attorney to help them best provide them
Right,
legal
yeah.
services, that has nothing to do with that. So that's kind of the same.
So, Andrew, that's a great question, because that might, well, folks, will be talking about this. That might change to that form that says acknowledgement of who represents who. Where you say, I'm a listing agent, I represent the seller. My fee for performing the ministerial action of the buyer is $2,000. We might have to, that's a great question, because if you want it from the buyer, then somewhere that's gotta be documented. So, yeah, it's a great question.
So the point of me bringing the question up is that it seems to me that there needs to be not only the buyer agency agreement, not only the disclosure of brokerage relationship for unrepresented parties, but an agreement of compensation if we are.
Well, if you have a buyer agency agreement with, I'm sorry, I don't,
Yeah. Yeah, so if we are not in buyer agency and we are working with a buyer. With ministerial act, in ministerial acts, and we want to receive compensation from the buyer. There should be a form that addresses, there should be an unrepresented agent form that says XYZ real estate company is not representing buyer X. And yet buyer X is to pay XYZ real estate company X amount of dollars. There
Why
should
not
be
just
a
make
form
sure-
that would disclose that. Because there is not an option for it in E.
okay.
Any reason you wouldn't just draft your own addendum for that? It's not gonna be used very frequently.
Yeah, and maybe this is just a question to let it play out for a while, Eric, to your point, and that's probably what we'll end up doing. I just. It's a little bit more. Liability and onerous. I would just ask if you guys are drafting those and send them in so we can take a look, because everybody's. Interpretation of a ministerial act, we just want to make
Yeah,
sure that.
that's what
They're not entering into agency, so I think if we could, to Daniel's point, it would be helpful if we can get a template so that we're clear of the lanes and the boundaries, so we don't cross into agency. But yeah, Eric, for the time being, if you're gonna draft one, please just send it up so we make sure we're not crossing.
I got counsel that reviews. Hey, is there, can we circle back to one quick question here? Is there any reason why we cannot put, instead of putting specific numbers in, why we can't put up to or not more than?
Somebody want to answer this?
Yeah, we talked about this for hours at the forms committee, and it may change, but at some point, we got to a point, Mary, and correct me if I'm wrong, where we said, let's get this form out there and see.
So we can still put it in.
Oh, no, he's not talking about that. You cannot be putting a range, you cannot be putting an unidentifiable number. It needs to be a specific number. This is required by the NAR settlement practice change. This is not an NVAR RED recommendation. This is something required under the court. It will be a court order. You cannot put up to, you cannot put a range of the number that is owed to you or paid out. It has to be a specific, identifiable, ascertainable number.
And it's always been that way.
Yeah, it always was that way, but
Yeah.
now it's just like, if you don't do it, you're held in contempt.
Right. Now, to my question previously, though, is the Forms Committee going to create such a form that I was
I
speaking?
can't, we are meeting tomorrow, so we can bring it up then.
That I think is, because that's a gap that will need to be addressed fairly quickly.
I know that we may have some hesitations in terms of like encouraging ministerial, like encouraging representation of unrepresented buyers. Because we are already trying to be like, you guys don't do dual agency. We get hotline calls with people like, I accidentally did dual agency, what do I do? That's like, oh my gosh, so it's quite a lot.
So,
So this-
so if in fact you do this form.
Sure.
I would then strongly encourage that the definition of ministerial acts
Yes,
is very narrowly, clearly and narrowly defined, so that we are very clear if we're entering, as Andrew likes to say, that lane, so we know what lane we're driving down.
the Virginia law definition of ministerial acts is basically anything that requires your real estate like judgment or discretion. And that's
broad.
difficult to define because it's going to be so case by case. I'm very, very scared to make that one.
So, in the past, we have explained that to agents by saying, if it's in the public domain.
That's a good way, that's a
you
good
can
rule of
answer the
thumb.
question. If it requires your professional opinion, now you're offering advice as a consultant, and you cross the line. So, someone can say, what were the property taxes on this last year? Oh, they were $9,620. Well, what do you think we should offer? Don't answer that question.
Yeah.
Because that requires your professional opinion, and you don't represent them, you represent the seller.
It does require like so much like quick thinking on the spot, and sometimes, you know, you as agents, you have such this urge to help people. It's
This hasn't typically come up in the past because we used it as an incentive to the seller by saying, well, instead of 6%, if the buyer's unrepresented, you're only gonna pay me 4. It used to be 3. I am gonna have to do more work because I'm helping the buyer do administrative stuff. So, but you're gonna save 2%. So we used to sell it like that, right? So, we're just gonna have to get it out there and work with it and see.
One final.
Yeah.
You mentioned dual agency.
Yes,
Where does that fall in all of this? Or is it now automatic, completely gone?
it's still there. It's still there, it's still legal under Virginia law, and we still don't recommend it.
And the brokerage as well.
Once again, I've lost the mouse, okay. Contingencies and clauses addendum, we removed the FISBO clause from there because it's now in the sales contract. So even if you have an unrepresented seller and you're representing a buyer's broker, but the ultimate amount goes in there that goes to the seller, to the buyer's broker. Okay, that's actually it for broker compensation.
Made it.
Yes. Let's see.
Yeah. That's not how long it takes, like an hour.
That only took us, what, 6 months?
Yes.
Can I ask a question of clarification?
Yes.
This is gonna sound so stupid after you talking for an hour and a half. Is the way that we will practice after this all goes through, that we have a buyer agency agreement, we have a compensation filled at 2.5%. We're gonna show property. So I call each listing agent and find out whether or not the seller is offering a buyer agency, any buyer agency compensation, whatever the correct word is, to offset that 2.5. And then I'll note on my note, on each listing, this one's offering 2.5, this one's offering 0, this one's offering 1.5. And that's how we find out whether or not the compensation is being offered by the seller. And then tagging on to that, when I asked about the thing being unenforceable, so I've called you, you're the listing agent on Main Street, you've told me your seller has signed at 2.5% offer for the buyer agent. Then we
Yeah.
get into negotiating the contract.
And they changed that.
Another buyer's agent in their contract has 2%. I did 2.5 because that's what the agent told me.
Yeah.
What happens in that, and is there a field in Bright that will clue us in as to whether or not there is buyer agency compensation being offered, or is that completely gone?
Yeah, so in MLS, any offers of compensation, any references to broker compensation have been removed and will be removed as of August 14th. The only thing that will be clear is if seller is offering any concessions or subsidies to buyer. That is still allowed. That can be a specific amount, that can be an unspecified amount. Basically saying, make an offer. But here's the thing. I know that reality seems daunting, but they actually, the purpose of the settlement was that they found that steering is a thing. They found that people were not approaching or showing homes to their buyers because of what compensation was being offered to the buyer's broker. So that's why they are eliminating that avenue. Whether or not I agree with it is past the point. This is what the settlement, this is what the court found, this is what the jury found, this is what the result of the settlement will be. They do not want people to decide whether to see a property, whether to put an offer on a property based on what compensation is being offered to the buyer's broker. Because it should be their argument is it should be the buyer's decision, not the buyer's broker's say or decision. So yes, it is very possible that they will offer you 2.5. They offer and they end up accepting an offer for another buyer that is asking for 2. But it's going to be like any other contract term negotiable. It's going to be like any other offer where you guys are you know, talking about any number that you can to make the most net sale for that seller. We've already updated our escalation addendum as well to show, to differentiate any request for contribution and calculating the net for the seller. But yeah, that's what it's gonna be. We're gonna see how the market reacts to this. It's gonna be really tough for you all from August until probably for the next year. But I don't have a crystal ball as to the nitty-gritty details of it, but yes.
So we do have to just call there, if you have marked, when you had the one form up there that said that the seller will or will not offer,
Yeah, so that's for concessions, correct? Yeah.
offer concessions, is that a clue? Does that also apply to compensation or only concessions or subsidy?
You can, it doesn't, you can always negotiate, even if the seller doesn't offer, or the listing doesn't have that clue. Nothing is stopping you from submitting an offer with a different sales price, asking for a contribution to concessions or to a buyer broker compensation. You're not breaking the law in doing that.
Terry has a question.
So will there be a field in Bright that actually shows an amount that matches what the listing agreement says?
There will be a field for concessions for seller to buyer.
That's what I'm thinking. Will it be an amount or just a yes or no?
You can put an amount there. They will have, there's an option to put an amount there.
But that is not enforceable. That's just, it's addressed in the contract. So they say they'll pay 3%, could be put however it's going to be put, but then when you actually get to the contract, that's how it's specified. So there may be no concession, even though they put 3% in there. Is that right?
Correct.
I think to simplify, I don't think you have to call anybody. You put in whatever you want in the contract and the contract reads, right?
Exactly.
Thank you. Yes, Eric.
Just
It
try-
only,
simple.
the thing it changes, Eric, is knowing what your buyer's cash position is.
Well, I
That's-
would look at it as just net, and it's net to the seller and
Right.
the buyer. I think in the grand scheme of things, is the buyer ever going to pay anything? My guess is probably not for a while. And if they do, it's going to be on the rare occasion. It's still going to be baked into the deal.
I had two recently where one buyer paid 1.5. Another one paid 1.
Well, I
Because
wouldn't
the seller was,
I wouldn't take one.
no, the seller offered 1%. The buyer had to pay the other 1.5 to me or to Remax.
I think you still could have put that in the contract, but
Can I ask
Well,
a question about extra commission?
Yes.
Okay, so I really think it only would apply at, like, you do your BBA, say you put whatever in it, and I really think one of the only places this would happen often is if you went to new construction and they'll give you a bonus if you've sold a couple this year or whatever. So they're giving you an extra $10,000 bonus. Well, I guess their contracts are totally different. So actually that changes my question, but I was going to say you write that into the contract, but even still you're saying you have to go back and amend the BBA to include that. But, and this might be a really dumb question, everybody else might know the answer. Is there a BBA amendment document?
Yes, it's the brokerage agreement amendment.
Is that new or has that always been there?
It was always there just for listing agreement amendment, but we amended it to include the buyer side as well. So you can use it. Yeah, it's K0004.
Okay, thank you.
Kathleen, just to build on that, I think it's also with reloads. Usually the reload company is willing to offer, a 3% to the buyer agent. And so what are we going to do if, well, if we start, we say to our buyer agent, yeah, I'll charge you 2.5%. Then you show them a reload that's offering 3%. The reload kind of has to, then what happens when you put an offer in on the reload and they're willing to pay you 3%, but you've been willing to work for 2.5 or 2.75? What happens to that extra?
I think in most of the cases, it's just gonna come down to communicating with our buyers ahead of time. Like, this is typical, there's gonna be one-offs, we'll address those if they come, and it's so rare, like if there's a once in a while where they end up getting the 0.5%, and we do it all the time anyway in the opposite direction. Give them a 1/4% or a 0.5% for,
Well, but I guess what I'm saying is with these relo companies, they don't give you much room to change terms. You sort of sign up and you say, I'll get 3, the buyer agent will get 3, and off we go. And you show the house and you tell everybody it's a 3% buyer agency compensation. So if we're in a relo agreement before this goes into effect, and then it goes into effect and all the buyers are asking for 2.5%, but we've offered 3, what happens there?
Okay, so now we have a good question. So, so there is something that, sorry. I don't like when these are recorded. We have a transition period, right? Our forms are going live next week, July 1. And August 14th is when the fields get removed from Bright. And August 17th is when the NAR practice change is going to affect. What happens in these 6 weeks? So one, obviously, we always recommend July 1, you switch over to our forms, because every 6 months we release, because the Virginia law changes every 6 months. And it changes on July 1. So our forms also get updated. Remember Virginia law, they also get updated with that. So please be sure to, when you do your new forms, if you have an active listing agreement, or if you have an active buyer broker agreement, but you don't have any offers yet, you don't have any pending sales contract or ratified sales contract. My recommendation, of course, to your brokerage's decision at the end of the day, is that you switch over to all new brokerage agreements. Okay, start getting familiar with it, use the new model. If everybody's on the same page, then in terms of how we are talking about compensation, how we're advertising it and whatnot, then it will make it easier for you all when it comes to the actual sales contract. If you have a ratified contract until August 14th, any offer of compensation made on the MLS will still be a binding offer of compensation. It's very, very key, because let's say you switch over to our new contract, July 1, that has seller paid and buyer broker compensation. Okay, let me go back to it. Okay, so you're using the new contract, but the offer of MLS is saying we're offering like 2.5% to all buyers brokers. But that's coming from the listing broker, right? To the buyer's broker, because that's what the cooperative compensation model was. That's what you guys currently have on your listings. But if you, and if a buyer comes in with their offer, and their offer is saying 2.5% here, you're technically, if you agree to that, your seller is going to be paying out 5%. Because they already have the offer of compensation from the listing broker to buyer's broker, but now they're asking also for a seller payment. So if you have an offer of compensation on the MLS or are doing cooperative compensation, but are also using our form at the same time, this is going to be an amount that is additional to anything that is coming out from the listing broker to the buyer's broker. So please use one or the other, or if you are using both, make sure you calculate it properly in here. Okay.
So if we have a listing that's on before August 14th, and we don't have an offer yet on August 14th, that offer of compensation, that's, let's say 2.5%, goes away.
Yeah, so essentially after August 14th, any offers of compensation made on the MLS, not only will they not be visible, but they will no longer be enforceable binding contracts between brokerages. So they're going to vanish.
So it's just in this limbo period.
It's a weird limbo period. We are releasing like a blog about it. We wrote it Friday, so please keep an eye out for your emails. I think it's coming into e-news tomorrow or Friday.
Can I ask why I look at these things and I always have a different viewpoint, it seems like, but in the listing agreement, why would you specify any amount for
I love that question.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would agree with
I love
you.
your answer.
So I would agree with you. Why even have paragraph 7 if it's ultimately negotiable in the sales contract? we talked about this at standard forms committee. We're like, what if we just did that? You know? We would be facing riots at our door, Eric. We would be genuinely, people would be coming at us with pitchforks because that would be full decoupling. So I joke internally that what we're doing now is like decoupling light, right? We're still referencing payments to the buyer's broker in the listing agreement. But I do think that we are moving towards the reality that the DOJ wants, which is ultimately the listing agreement won't address buyer broker payment at all. It'll ultimately be determined in the sales contract and that's it. But we
so-
understand not every agent has been paying attention to the news this past year. It's a huge practice change, and to ask them to completely remove that mindset all at once is a huge ask.
Okay, hypothetically, you're the seller. And I'm the listing agent.
Yeah.
And I say, I wouldn't put anything here.
Yeah,
I'd put 0 and then let it negotiate in the contract.
yeah, you can do that.
Because
You don't even have to use it. You don't even have to use it.
okay,
It seems logical that that's the way that it'll ultimately end up going.
But we want to transition. you
I've been
all.
fighting this for a million years because I would write in my own compensation and contracts, and then it was, some people called it a code of ethics violation. I never bought that, but whatever it is or it isn't. I don't really care. I never got in any trouble for it, luckily, but I just think it's all net, and everyone worries about everything, and there's really nothing to worry about. It's pretty simple stuff. So anyway, my 2 cents.
We love it.
I'm gonna mute.
You have had
So it was really, we have ongoing webinars, and one of the things in the webinar was that once an actual property closes, that you can then put in the final
yes,
compensation
yes,
estimation. Does that include
Right.
what was?
yes. They are actually allowing after closing for the costs to be visible, including what contributions will be to the buyer, I don't know actually if they are differentiating what's going to the buyer versus what's going to the buyer's broker. I guess we'll see how that turns out, but it will give you as a listing agent and your seller some indication as to what the market is doing, which I think is really helpful for developing your costs. Okay, we have nothing else on broker compensation. I can move on to our other forms changes. But we can also take like a 2-minute break. Thank you, because I actually am really thirsty.
I actually still do have a question. If anybody cares to answer, feel free to jump in during the break. Because I am taking a relo listing, and typically we like to offer 3% to the buyer agent because it's a little more paperwork. They might not know what they're doing. It might incentivize buyer agents to show a relo property. So this is going to all be signed tomorrow, and then August 14th is going to roll around, and we'll just change the language to say, call me about, the terms, and like Eric said, we'll just work it out. But what is the buyer agent who said they'd take 2% going to do with the 3% my seller's relo company is offering them?
Buyer.
That's charged to the buyer. So they would request that from the buyer.
No, the reload company's offering it. So Kathy, I think what's going to happen is the reload company is going to keep it, or the buyer agent is going to have to amend their buyer agency agreement according to the way that this is going.
Got it.
Kind of like a subsidy, like, when some idiot agent asks for, X subsidy that's more than the allotted, the seller keeps it. Unless they know what they're doing and can get a principal curtailment or something like that. Yeah, so I think that's probably all that's going to happen there. I think it's great. You're getting 3% from them. You should try to get higher on the listing side.
Yeah,
Well, and that's a good point, because if everybody's just gonna be asking for 2.5, I may as well get 3.5 instead of see it go down the drain. But
Yeah.
I'd like to offer 3% to buyer agents to incentivize them to show the house.
Well, there won't be any offer out there really of that. Yeah, I think it's great, but in theory.
Kathy, I think you can also use as an opportunity to reach out to Aries, for example, and ask them, because oftentimes that money is included in their corporate relocation package. And so just want to clarify, whereas they are signing a buyer agency agreement, it ends up being less, who gets that money? And that's probably a question that we just need to run up the flagpole to them to see how the reload company is going to want to address that. And also an opportunity to build, more connection by bringing that question to them.
Okay,
And Kathy, on the other side is, what about those reload buyers? Because they're getting some comp, but that comp is not including commission. So there's going to need to be discussion there as well.
Yeah, let's grab Colette and get on a call with them. I think it'd just be nice to talk through it with them so we can get clear on reload.
okay. I'd like to do that really soon. Like
Yesterday?
today.
All right, go ahead, send Colette and I an email, and we'll see if we can't get somebody on the horn today.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. All right, we're gonna take another 1 minute bio break. Be right back.
I will back. I thought the same thing, and the thing is, like, when the laws for anything now. Every bill. But I pulled up against the bill because I feel they tried. And I actually read it and I was like, oh my, did you guys notice that they changed this? And I know, right, he was like, we talked about, you know, the attorneys called me, like, I was like, read it.
You know, maybe HOA thing, the laws and legislature, oh my God, I've been at so many meetings down in Richmond, and I was like, what were you idiots thinking?
All I know is that I was just negotiating for a client, and they were, okay, so how can we get out? If we waive all of this, how do we get out? And I could not say.
Can't.
HOA. I could not say that, and that blew my mind. I'm like, oh
Be
my
the
God.
one way.
Yes, the one way. The last protection buyers have, and only a freaking buyer. It's nothing, there's nothing, I've never mind. It's just,
We need to put all the legislative
But-
laws that goes over.
but they already contract, but the contract still says.
And then when they try to fix it, they made it even worse.
I'll show you. So.
They changed it by saying that you can extend it to 7 days.
I'm looking at you. Should give me some of that. They've already taken away.
Actually, was.
And then you go back and say, oh, we changed our mind to the sellers. And say, we want 3 to 7 days. And now. the agents jump. So it's now the seller. Well, we just think about the things in all. Yeah, that's- You know, it's really not gonna be that big change. All you do is change out what it's gonna be. Mostly to the agents who used to say to their buyers, oh, no, it's so.
To me, that's enough.
Because it rate, buyer.
That's the thing.
That's
people
the seller.
They're not pushing up. Right.
Well, I think the major justification it's like it's don't have much money to start out with. So, okay, that's smart. You don't buy. But I'm gonna send it by road, but you're gonna say. I really do. We understand, we get it. The sellers are gonna be fine, because they use it anyway, they use their.
That's exactly. And I was. So. Yeah, that's something that I don't. Think. And today, so that's the part here. I am. But I also understand that salary. It's not a conversation. That's it.
Yeah.
There's a buyer.
I don't
Now it's on.
Well, thank you.
That was good. But, we don't need to. Somebody makes some tools each other. Yeah. Sorry. That's what's. A tough hour.
It's some fun stuff.
All right, whenever you guys are ready, we can get started on the next portion. I do have some more bad news for you all, when it comes to the sales contract and some of the changes that we've made there. So, well, actually something good. We did introduce a new definition for business days, because you all have lives. You guys, we want you to go home on weeknights. We want you to, have weekends. So for the EMD paragraph and the settlement paragraph, those are the changes that we made. We introduced business days there. So now the deadline, when you have a blank for number of days to deposit the EMD, that is now business days to deposit the EMD. So that you're not scrambling on a ratified contract at 5 PM on a Friday before Memorial Day weekend to get the EMD in there. So we're hoping that is helpful for you all. If you guys really like it, we can introduce it to other sections of the contract, like our contingencies, whatnot. But we do need your feedback to know if you like the business dates or not. So this is another major change, and this is pursuant to a Virginia law that is coming July 1, not our decision. Resale Disclosure Act. So you all remember last year, the Resale Disclosure Act was created. And this year they have revised it again, effective July 1. So the seller must still deliver the resale certificate. That has not changed. That cannot be waived or modified. The buyer must still receive the resale certificate, but they've added some clarification here. So one, the seller or their agent can request it from the association. And delivery has to be either to the buyer or their agent. So please, as a buyer's agent, keep an eye on your email. If the resale certificate comes to you, you need to make sure it gets to your buyer right away so that they can start reviewing it. Just because it comes to you and you have, like, for example, if you have both emails on the contract, you're like, oh, it didn't get to my buyer, I guess it's not proper delivery. No, technically, according to Virginia law, even if it comes to you, it's proper delivery. So you guys need to be on top of it. Now, bigger change. The 3-day right of rescission period for buyers to review the sale, the resale certificate and ultimately void the contract if they want to. That has been changed to allow for the parties to negotiate that time frame on the contract directly. So there's no longer 3 days extended to 7 days. It is basically a time period to be negotiated by the parties. So what does that look like? So this is our gigantic paragraph 8 in our contract for Resale Disclosure Act, which has the required Virginia law language. Just clarifying that delivery is either to the purchaser or the purchaser's agent, and that the purchaser or the purchaser's agent has the right to request an update. But remember, there's 3 rights of rescission periods for buyers when it comes to the resale certificate. 1, within blank days. If delivery is before ratification of the contract, it starts ticking at ratification. 2, within blank days. If delivery is after ratification, it starts ticking upon delivery. And then 3, which is not really a blank. At any time before settlement, if the resale certificate is not delivered. Okay, so you can put any number in that blank. What's your next question? Or yeah, can I put 0? Yes, you can put 0, but just putting 0 is not itself a waiver of the buyer's right of rescission. Because don't forget option 3, buyer can still always waive it if they don't deliver it. Okay, and then I'll waive it. They can always void the contract if they do not deliver it. They also, technically, the Virginia definition of day is a calendar day, which means that it ends at 11:59 p.m. But it also starts ticking on the next day. So if delivery is at like 5 p.m. on a Tuesday, the 0th day doesn't technically begin until Wednesday at 12:01. So you technically have from 5 p.m. to 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday to void. So that's something to help your buyer if the seller is really pressuring you to put 0. Now, of course, you can always just cross out this section and say buyer completely waives their right of rescission, but that has to be explicit. It needs to be buyer completely waives, like all 3 of these, they waive their right to void the contract under the Resale Disclosure Act. You can do that now pursuant to Virginia law, where it wasn't allowed before. Before, the buyer could not waive it. Another thing to note is that if these are left blank, it defaults 3 days. So that's actually the best practice that I recommend. I usually never recommend anything on the sales contract be left blank. We recommend like addressing it in some way, even if it's not applicable to you, write NA. But over here, I would actually leave these blank because then that gives your buyer the protection. Like it defaults to 3 days no matter what. I understand that this is taking away the last buyer contingency that they have left, but this is what the Virginia law is going to be. So, yeah.
I mean, if I remember correctly, state law says buyer or buyer's representative or agent, right?
Yes.
So we can't change that in the delivery line. You can't change state law in the contract. We can't change in delivery by putting our email address in the word and
Right.
the buyer's email address, thinking you're creating a dual obligation of them to send to both parties because you can't change state law in the contract. So they can, so the seller can choose, or the listing agent can choose to send it to the buyer or the buyer agent, and that complies with delivery by state law.
Yeah. I would still put both emails though.
Yes, most agents are gonna do it,
Right.
but you're creating a contractual requirement because of the state law.
Right.
And FYI, G-Card has handled that differently.
But Maryland is way more,
Yeah.
progressive than us when it comes to protecting buyers.
Yeah.
So that's unfortunately the reality that we are in, but again, my actual best recommendation is to leave this blank. Okay, do we have any other questions about Resale Disclosure Act before I move on to other forms?
Just to take the time of the essence.
Yes.
With, so now if a hardworking agent were to send over a ratified contract at 12:01 a.m.,
Yes,
the date, the business day, if you will, would start
it's not business day, it's Virginia calendar day.
Virginia calendar. Okay, got it. But technically, the clock starts ticking, the one full day would be.
After. Yeah, so
next
if
day.
it's delivered at 12:01 a.m. on Wednesday.
Yeah.
The first day is technically the next day.
Thursday by midnight. Would
It's
be the-
Thursday at midnight.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Can you explain, sorry, can you explain why you're saying the best option is to keep it blank?
Because according to Virginia law, if left blank, it defaults to 3 days.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Anything else? I know this is a big change as well as the broker compensation stuff, so I really want to make sure that you guys understand it. Okay. Keep going. Okay,
Sorry, could I, I couldn't unmute for a minute there, but, still, if the seller provides an incomplete package on
yes,
day one, the clock still starts.
correct.
And then
That's-
the buyer reviews it and goes, this isn't complete, they're 2 years old.
Correct.
Then can we write an addendum to extend this review until the seller gets us the complete package?
Yeah, as long as the seller agrees, in the addendum, you can always, that's the thing. So the law says that the time frame is to be negotiated by the parties in the sales contract. So if you guys want to extend it, you can. We still have our extension form. You can use it to change this date, to change this time frame. But incomplete delivery is still delivery. So you can, it would still start ticking the clock regardless. Okay, the listing agreements, we actually changed the term paragraph of the listing agreements. This is because of Bright's changes now that they have, you have to enter listings into the MLS within 2 days of the start of the listing term. And since we didn't have a definition for listing term in there before, we just had agreement term, which is basically the effective date of the agreement when you and your seller sign off on the listing agreement. You would have had to enter your listings into Bright within 2 days of you signing the agreement. And that's just like unfeasible for a lot of agents. So we introduced the definition for listing term. So now when you fill out the term of the agreement, there are 2 terms to be aware of. So one, agreement term, which is when the agreement is signed, that's when you begin providing your real estate services to the seller. And 2, listing term, that is, and this definition comes from Bright, that is when seller instructs broker to allow any potential buyers to learn about the property. So once you start talking about this with other agents, once you start, putting up the sign, you start working on your advertising, that's when people start to learn about the property. And then within 2 days of that date, you have to put it into Bright. It's 2 calendar days. And you put it into either office exclusive, active, or coming soon.
So this really, from a compliance aspect, this really helps to eliminate a lot of that stuff that we were dealing with over the last year or so. Where we were in this limbo land where we're not quite ready to get on the market. But we don't really want to go office exclusive, but now we have to go office exclusive because we can't put it in coming soon status. And so that kind of changes that and eliminates that complexity and that requirement to go office exclusive, because you can now put it in the agreement, in the terms when the actual effective date starts. And similarly, in Bright MLS, now the 21 days coming soon is gone. So
Yeah.
it can be indefinite.
Yeah, I was actually just gonna get to that in the next slide. So we did revise our MLS marketing paragraph as well. Wanted just to clarify that no offers of compensation are to be made on the MLS after August 14th. But also we've added a new checkbox to authorize seller display of buyer broker compensation off the MLS, like on third-party websites, because you are still allowed to say we are offering compensation to buyers brokers on your social media, on your sign writers, on your broker's website, etc. And we've also updated it for the new Bright MLS rules. For example, we removed the 21-day limitation from coming soon, and we updated the office exclusive paragraph with their new rules. So you guys, the Bright changes, there's actually quite a lot of Bright changes coming up in August. We really recommend that you attend a Bright training webinar. They have like a lot of tools to help keep you up to date. They just released, like they just sent an email out like yesterday with more information about what's coming. They have a lot coming August 14th. So please, please keep an eye on what's going on with Bright, especially for office exclusives. I mentioned leases very, very briefly. Why did I not talk about leases this whole time? Because leases and rentals are not subject to the NAR settlement agreement. They are not under the same scrutiny. The way that the commission structure works for that in our forms has actually not changed. So if you are doing a lease listing, you are still, our forms will still facilitate cooperative compensation, meaning from the landlord broker portion of it going to tenant broker. That model has not really changed. So we've just very, very slightly updated our compensation paragraph in the lease listing agreement to just clarify again, landlord will pay total compensation is here, and then the shared portion is in subsection B. So that has not really changed in the same way that our sales ones have. We started working on it actually as a forms committee. We started trying to make it mirror the sales listing agreement so that they look similar and that they work similarly. But then we were like, we got to the lease and we were like, oh my gosh, how can we put broker compensation into a lease? There's no settlement agent handling disbursement. It doesn't work the same way. And is realistically any landlord going to offer contribution to a tenant broker or any sort of incentive or concession to a tenant? No. So because we know that the market, but this is something that we are really going to be monitoring the market on. If, you guys get back to us and say, hey, this is how it's going to work now for rentals, then we will change our forms accordingly. But until then, we are not changing our lease listing forms too much.
And I have kids who are doing leases in other states and learning a little bit about that. And I think it would be helpful for NVAR to see how they're doing it, because I don't know if they're taking advantage of these kids or not, but some of the agents representing tenants just, do like, you pay me 1 month's rent and I'll get you a place. And the tenants are paying the broker, the realtors directly.
If that's the way that the market shifts in this area, then our forms will be updated to address that. But as far as we understand, that's just not the market reality here in Northern Virginia. But again, if the market changes, we'll change it. Okay. Exclusive right to represent tenant agreement. This one just mirrors the buyer broker agreement, so not too many changes here. The lease, there were quite a few changes, but they're mostly cosmetic and in response to law. There were about 10 or 12 new VRLTA laws for July 1. One of the big ones is addressing rent chart. So that chart that starts like the second or third page of the lease, it's actually been moved up to the first page of the lease. And that's because there's a new law that all fees charged to tenants must begin on the first page of leases, and they all must be in there or included in an addendum. My recommendation is that they are all in that rent chart. You identify every single fee. If it's not in that chart or an addendum, it cannot be charged to the tenant pursuant to this new law. We've also just clarified some other things, cleaned up some things like the move-in inspection paragraph. We renamed it to landlord's move-in inspection to make it clear that it's not the lease listing agent's duty to do that. Tenant obligations, we added refrigerator water filters, changing that to the list. And clarified, it was already in there, but it wasn't clear that if pest infestation is caused by the tenant, it's the tenant's responsibility, but if not, it is the landlord's responsibility. The move out inspection paragraph, we also cleaned this up. We added an other, we combined the requirements to clean the unit. And what else? Yeah, this is the new move out inspection. This was some of the changes that we did, like added refrigerator water, remove this section where you pre-approve an amount taken out from the security deposit because nobody was using it properly. The airport, okay, so for those who sell homes in Loudoun County, the airport impact overlay district disclosure requirement was actually declared unenforceable by a Virginia law coming on July 1. And yesterday, Loudoun County Board released something that they're like, yeah, we're not going to enforce this anymore. So if you sell homes in Loudoun County, you no longer need to make this disclosure. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that's a failure in our education front, but also you don't need to worry about it because as of July 1, you no longer need to make this disclosure in Loudoun County. So we're removing this form from our library.
And we're removing it from the checklist as well.
Yeah. Some other law changes that affect you all in your practice. Your CE credit hours are being reallocated for renewal cycles beginning next month. They are basically the same number of hours, but they're just reallocating how the electives work. Licensing, real estate licenses are now required for wholesales. So meaning you either have to have a real estate license to do a wholesale or work with a real estate agent or broker. There's a new Unfair Real Estate Service Agreement Act declaring certain types of brokerage agreements unenforceable or illegal. For example, brokerage agreements that run for 20 years or that create a lien on the land. Those are now, or bind future owners. Those are now declared illegal. Short-term rentals, that's not really for this area. Easier for unlawful detainers to amend the amounts due if that is ongoing. Easier to remove squatters. For military personnel, voiding early under the Civil Service Members Relief Act. The 35-mile radius requirement was removed. We've always been advising that don't ignore that 35 miles because federal law doesn't require it. But state law conflicted, but now they've cleaned it up and now it complies with federal law. Routine maintenance for the VRLTA, landlord has to give 72 hours of it and it has to be completed within 14 days. Routine maintenance is something that's like, you don't need to do a repair. Like you're not fixing something, you're just doing what you typically do. Like for example, like every 6 months, we clean out the dryer duct or something like that.
Go back one slide real quick.
Yes. Yes.
As pertains to unfair real estate
Yes.
service agreement acts and creating a lien or encumbrance, you know, is that a law?
Yes, it's a new law coming July 1.
Okay, cause I know some builders that do substantial marketing efforts and that is there like for pre-sales, if you will, on homes that are to be torn down. And they encumber the property as security instrument for their efforts, so they can no longer do that, I'm assuming.
Well, it's a real estate service agreement act, so it's basically in brokerage agreements. So I'm not sure that it
So then
applies
maybe I'll
to.
share it to brokers that are doing heavy renovations as a part of their listing service where they're putting $50,000 into the property where sellers don't have the cash to renovate it, and then they're encumbering the property with a lien. As a part of their service, they can no longer do that.
To be honest, I don't know the nitty gritty of this law. I actually didn't think that we had agreements like this in this region because I just think of our forms.
Maryland did the similar thing and they put a 1-year term. time.
Yeah, ours is 1 year. It's cut off.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's Maryland's doing the 1 year, so that's fine.
If you want to talk about the nitty gritty of the law, just submit a legal hotline question and I can go through.
There, yeah.
Other things, easier to early terminate if you're a victim of sexual assault or violence. Condemnation, if the unit is condemned, this happened in East Sturge. If the unit is condemned, then the tenant is responsible for, not the tenant, the landlord may be responsible for any actual damages that the tenant suffered. The fees thing I mentioned, copies of a signed lease and the statement of tenant rights and responsibilities must be provided to the tenant within 10 business days of signing. So that is it.
that is all I have.
Can I ask a question about coming soon again?
Yeah, yes.
So what do you think the new practice is going to be if there's no longer a 21-day cap?
Whatever you want.
I think we're
Well,
gonna-
I guess I'm asking all you great realtors, what do you think the best practice is under this scenario? Still 1 week or 2 weeks, or what do you think?
No, we're gonna see more listings sooner, because I'm not gonna wait to put it on, because I'm trying to calculate the 21 days. So I think it's going to improve our ability to see what's coming on the market.
Exactly. So you'll take the listing, immediately put it into coming soon status. And indefinite until you're ready, if it takes you a week, if it takes you a month to get the property ready, so be it. And that's the way it'll be.
Can I give a can I give a counterpoint on that? I mean, the real estate market does move a little bit like the stock market. And if you're putting on a property a month or two in advance, you're really helping the competition and not helping yourself, because they're just going to price against you. And
I
if you-
agree.
and
Sorry.
then you can't modify the price during coming soon.
I agree with that, and I think the listing becomes stale.
And I
And-
want to, can I
and we-
piggyback another question?
Yeah,
Well, you can finish on, go ahead, finish up.
I agree with Kathleen and Eric.
Thanks. Hey, quick question. Is there anything, I noticed the listing term as like a fallback that kicks on automatically at 90 days if you don't fill it in or whatever. Is there anything to preclude you? And I like to do things differently and make it simple, to say, the listings for a week, but renewable automatically in 30-day increments unless I hear otherwise from the seller.
The listing or the buyer? Why
On a
would you
listing,
put the
on a listing. I got a listing, or let's say I put in a buyer broker agreement as well. That the term is a week. And it renews automatically in week long, 2 week long, 3 week long, whatever the time frame is, automatically, unless I get written notice from the seller, or in the case of the buyer agency, the buyer.
That's
Why
a
do you
question.
like
If brokerage allows that. I personally would not recommend that practice.
Why not?
It just seems like, why can't you just have a termination date?
Because if I want to take a listing and I don't want to hold my guy to 30 days or 60 days because we're determining price, maybe I'm taking this listing, let's say, for example, I have one that's not coming up between he's deciding between January and June of next year. Okay, so I want to lock him down, but I don't want to scare him off either. Normally, my practice has been, okay, I'm not going to do anything in writing yet, but I did get screwed by someone who undercut the commish. So I prefer now to lock it down, but I don't want to put a year's term on it or whatever, because he's still trying to decide on the timeline.
Wouldn't that create an unspecified term?
No, the term is specified. It's just renewable automatically unless I get written notice from the seller.
No, but wouldn't it be arguably specific that material to the contract?
I'm trying to get other agents not to meddle with if they say, hey, do you have a signed listing agreement? The answer is simple, yes or no. It's then nobody else can meddle in it.
Ariane,
Genuinely, I do not know. I just personally, there's something about that recommendation that just gives me pause. I can't articulate exactly why I don't like it, but I don't like it. I have to look at the Unfair Real Estate Service Agreement Act into depth to see if there's something that's specifically addressed auto renewal. But if you're really concerned about it, I don't know. I feel like that's a brokerage conversation, whether you're allowed to do that kind of thing.
Eric, I think practically, I think it works. So, I mean, I'm inclined to lean on what's simple and get more deals done. So maybe we just look into the unfair.
I'm with you, Andrew. Let's get the deals done.
We'll just double up, make sure that,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm with you that practically that makes sense to get more deals done. But I'd like to lean that way. We'll just double check it.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Okay.
I actually, one quick question just for, we're going back a little bit, but just to make absolutely certain on the resale certificate disclosure, if you put in 0 days,
Yes,
if your docs are delivered at 5 PM, you could still void up to 59 PM that day?
probably yes. Yes,
Yes,
yes.
thank you.
That's a pretty big gamble though, right? Cause you
It's a big gamble.
ratify at 5 PM and they say, yeah, we'll get you the docs, and you tell your buyer, oh, we'll get the docs and you can void in the next 3 hours, and then the docs don't show up till the next 2 days.
Well, the goalposts move, but the business practice is the same, so I'm with you, Kathy, that don't. I think Kristen was just trying to clarify the actual date,
Yeah.
but 95% of them won't run up to the last minute, so.
Yep.
But yeah, I would agree that it is risky. You just put 1 day then.
Kristen, would you agree with all any HOA violations are still covered, correct?
HOA violations, the seller is still responsible for, correct?
Okay. Could the buyer change that to say 0 days and I'll absorb any HOA violations as well?
You can do that in your contract.
Great, because I just did it.
Okay, thank you all for having me.
Good
Leave
job.
all for any follow-up. This is a lot, I know, it's 2 hours that I ask of you all, and I appreciate you all for listening.
Good job.
Good question.
Very helpful, thank you.
Sorry, it's hard to do this, so 3 days.
Glad you did that.
I'm sorry to like run out of energy at the end.
No, you're fine.
Like, so, yeah, so I've told her 10 times she needs to get a license, but she hasn't got a license. So what do we do in a case like that?
So